The crack of a twig underfoot sent my heart racing. A gunshot in the silence of the Tennessee woods. I froze, rifle heavy in my hands, as the shadowed trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the fading October light. Caleb's breath beside me was steady, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and searching, like he knew something I didn't. "Eli, you spook too easy," Caleb teased, his voice low, a grin tugging at his lips. His broad shoulders brushed mine as he adjusted his grip on his own rifle, the familiarity of his presence both grounding and unnerving. We'd grown up together in Shiloh, a speck of a town where everyone knew your sins before you did. Hunting was our escape, a ritual since we were kids, but today felt different, electric, like the air before a storm. I forced a laugh, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us, something bigger than the deer we were tracking. "Just don't want you scaring off our dinner," I shot back, but my voice trembled. Caleb's grin softened, and for a moment, his hazel eyes held mine too long, stirring something deep in my chest I wasn't ready to name. We were 18, on the cusp of leaving this town for good. I'd gotten a scholarship to a college in Nashville, a chance to escape Shiloh's suffocating grip. Caleb, though, was staying tied to his father's church, to expectations heavier than the rifle in his hands. Pastor John, Caleb's dad, was the heart of Shiloh, a man whose sermons could make you feel like God himself was judging you. He'd raised Caleb to be the perfect son, strong, devout, untouchable. But I knew Caleb better than that. I saw the cracks in his armor, the way his hands shook when his dad's voice boomed through the pews. "Keep up, city boy," Caleb said, nudging me forward. His tone was playful, but there was an edge to it, a tension that had been building for months. We'd been inseparable since we were 10, building forts in these woods, sharing secrets under the stars. But lately, every touch lingered, every glance carried weight. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining the way his hand brushed mine when we passed the thermos of coffee, or how his laugh sounded different when it was just us. The woods grew darker as we moved deeper, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. We were following a trail of hoofprints, faint in the soft ground, but my mind wasn't on the hunt. It was on Caleb, on the way he'd looked at me last week when we'd sat by the creek. His voice barely a whisper as he said, "You ever feel like you're hiding from yourself?" I hadn't answered, too scared of what my own words might reveal. A rustle in the underbrush snapped me back to the present. Caleb raised his rifle, his movements fluid, practiced. "There," he whispered, pointing to a flicker of movement, a deer, its antlers catching the last rays of sunlight. My heart pounded, not for the shot, but for the way Caleb's shoulder pressed against mine, steadying me. I didn't want to shoot. I didn't want to break this moment. "Take it," he urged, his voice soft but insistent. I raised my rifle, peering through the scope, but my hands were shaking. The deer stared back, its eyes wide and unblinking, and for a second, I saw myself in its gaze, trapped, exposed, desperate to run. I lowered the gun. "I can't," I muttered, stepping back. Caleb's brow furrowed, but he didn't push. Instead, he lowered his own rifle, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said quietly, and we stood there, the silence between us louder than the forest. I wanted to tell him everything, how I'd been wrestling with feelings I couldn't name, how I'd spent nights staring at the ceiling, terrified of what it meant to want him the way I did. But Shiloh wasn't a place for truths like that. Not for boys like us. "Let's head back," Caleb said finally, his voice tight. I nodded, swallowing the words I couldn't say. We turned toward the trail that led to the clearing where Pastor John was waiting with the truck. He'd insisted on coming today, saying he wanted to keep an eye on us. I thought it was just his usual overbearing control, but the way he'd watched us all morning, his eyes sharp and unyielding, made my skin crawl. As we walked, Caleb's hand brushed mine again, and this time, he didn't pull away. My breath caught, and I glanced at him, but he kept his eyes on the path ahead, his jaw tight. The air between us was alive, crackling with something unspoken, something dangerous. I wanted to grab his hand, to hold on and never let go, but fear kept my fingers curled into fists. When we reached the clearing, Pastor John was leaning against the truck, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. The Bible he always carried was tucked under his arm, its edges worn from years of preaching. "No luck?" he asked, his voice low, almost accusing. Caleb shook his head. "Got spooked," he said, glancing at me. I felt the weight of Pastor John's gaze, heavy and searching, like he could see right through me. My stomach twisted. Did he know? Could he see the truth I was hiding, the one I hadn't even admitted to myself? "Get in," Pastor John said, his tone clipped. We climbed into the truck, Caleb in the front, me in the back. The drive back to town was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine and the faint rustle of leaves against the windows. I stared out at the darkening woods, my mind racing. Something was coming, something bigger than me, bigger than Caleb, bigger than Shiloh. And I wasn't sure any of us were ready for it. The truck rattled down the dirt road, and I kept my eyes on the window, watching the trees blur into shadows. Caleb sat rigid in the front seat, his hands clenched in his lap, while Pastor John's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The silence was suffocating, like the air before a lightning strike, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving towards something inevitable. Back at Caleb's house, a modest brick home beside the church, Pastor John disappeared into his study without a word. Caleb and I retreated to the back porch, where the air was cooler, tinged with the scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's fire. We sat on the steps, our shoulders close but not touching, the tension from the woods still lingering. "You okay?" Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was staring at the ground, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. I wanted to tell him I wasn't, that I was terrified, confused, and drowning in feelings I didn't understand. But all I managed was a nod. "Yeah, I lied. Just tired." He didn't buy it. Caleb always knew when I was hiding something. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say it's whatever it was that had been building between us. But then the screen door creaked, and Pastor John stepped out, his shadow falling over us like a storm cloud. "Eli, you staying for dinner?" he asked, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. I hesitated. Staying meant sitting through another meal under his watchful gaze, but leaving meant walking away from Caleb, and I wasn't ready for that. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. Pastor John nodded and went back inside, leaving us alone again. Caleb let out a breath, like he'd been holding it the whole time. "He's been weird lately," Caleb muttered, his voice low. "Ever since I told him I'm not going to Bible college." I raised an eyebrow. "You told him that?" Caleb nodded, his jaw tight. "Last week. Said I want to figure things out on my own." He didn't take it well. I could imagine. Pastor John had always seen Caleb as his legacy, the next in line to lead Shiloh's flock. The idea of Caleb breaking free was unthinkable. But I admired him for it, even if it scared me. Caleb was braver than I was, always had been. We sat in silence for a while, the crickets starting their evening chorus. I wanted to ask him what he meant by figuring things out, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nudged his shoulder with mine, a small gesture that felt like a confession. He nudged me back, and for a second, everything felt right. Dinner was tense. Pastor John prayed longer than usual, his voice heavy with meaning I couldn't decipher. Caleb kept his head down, pushing his food around his plate, while I tried to focus on the mashed potatoes and avoid Pastor John's gaze. After dinner, Caleb offered to walk me home, and I didn't argue. The streets of Shiloh were quiet, the only light coming from the street lamps and the faint glow of the church steeple. We walked side by side, our steps in sync, the night air cool against my skin. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but Caleb spoke first. "Eli," he said, stopping under a street lamp. His voice was shaky, like he was standing on the edge of something. "There's something I need to tell you." My heart stopped. I turned to face him, the light casting shadows across his face, making him look older, more vulnerable. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a car pulled up beside us. Pastor John. His window was down, his face unreadable in the dark. "Caleb, get in," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Eli, you're close enough to walk." Caleb hesitated, his eyes locked on mine, 1,000 unspoken words passing between us. Then he climbed into the car, and I watched as they drove away, my chest tight with something I couldn't name. I walked the rest of the way home alone, the night pressing in around me, heavy with secrets. The next morning, Caleb texted me to meet him at the creek, our old spot. When I got there, he was already waiting, skipping rocks across the water. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept, and there was a bruise on his cheek that hadn't been there yesterday. "What happened?" I asked, my voice sharp with worry. He shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "Dad and I had a fight." "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. I could see it in the way he held himself, like he was carrying the weight of the world. I stepped closer, my hand hovering near his arm, wanting to comfort him but not knowing how. "Caleb, talk to me," I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes raw and unguarded. "I told him," he said, his voice breaking. "I told him I'm not like everyone else. That I don't want the life he's planned for me. He stopped, his breath hitching. "That I love you." The world stopped. My heart pounded in my ears, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Caleb loved me. The words I'd been too scared to say were staring me in the face, and all I could do was stand there, frozen. "Caleb," I whispered, but before I could say more, he turned away, his shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I shouldn't have." "No." I cut him off, stepping closer. My hand found his, and I held on tight, like I could anchor us both. "I love you too." The words felt like freedom and fear all at once. Caleb's eyes met mine, wide and disbelieving, and for a moment, it was just us, the creek rushing past, the world falling away. Then he pulled me into a hug, his arms strong and warm, and I buried my face in his shoulder, letting the truth settle between us. But the moment didn't last. A shadow moved in the trees, and we pulled apart, my heart racing. Pastor John stepped into the clearing, his face pale, his eyes burning with something I couldn't read. He'd heard everything. Pastor John's silence was louder than any sermon he'd ever preached. He stood there, Bible in hand, his eyes moving between Caleb and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't fit. My hand was still in Caleb's, and I didn't let go. even as fear clawed at my chest. "Dad," Caleb started, his voice steady but strained. "Let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Pastor John said, his voice low. "Dangerous." I heard enough. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped in front of Caleb, my heart pounding. I'd never seen Pastor John like this, his face a mix of anger, pain, and something else I couldn't name. "Eli, go home," he said, his eyes never leaving Caleb. "This is between me and my son." I didn't move. "No," I said, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "I'm not leaving him." Caleb's hand tightened around mine, and I felt his gratitude, his fear, in that single gesture. Pastor John's jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But then his shoulders sagged, and he looked away, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "Both of you, come with me," he said finally, turning back toward the path. We followed, Caleb's hand slipping from mine, but his presence steady beside me. The walk back to the house was silent, each step heavy with dread. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew it would change everything. Inside, Pastor John led us to his study, a room lined with bookshelves and a heavy oak desk. He closed the door behind us, the click of the latch like a gunshot in the quiet. He sat down, gesturing for us to do the same, but we stayed standing, side by side, like soldiers facing a firing squad. "I've spent my life preaching love," Pastor John said, his voice softer now, almost broken. "Love for God, for your neighbor, for your family. But I've failed you, Caleb. I've failed you both." I blinked, caught off guard. This wasn't what I'd expected. Caleb's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice sharp. "What are you talking about?" Pastor John ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling. "I've been hard on you, son. Too hard. Because I was scared. Scared of what I saw in you. Scared of what it meant. Scared of my own past." Caleb's breath caught, and I felt my own chest tighten. Pastor John's past. The man who'd built his life on certainty, on righteousness, was admitting to something hidden, something human. "When I was your age," he continued, his eyes distant, "I had a friend. His name was Thomas. We were close, closer than brothers. I loved him, in a way I didn't understand, in a way I was taught was wrong." His voice broke, and he looked down at his hands, the Bible forgotten on the desk. I pushed him away. I chose fear over love, and I've carried that regret every day since. The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on us. I glanced at Caleb, saw the shock in his eyes, the way his hands trembled. Pastor John had loved a man. The man who'd preached against sin, who'd held Shiloh in an iron grip, had been hiding the same truth we were. "Why didn't you tell me?" Caleb asked, his voice raw. "All those sermons, all those years you made me feel like I was broken." Pastor John's eyes filled with tears. "Because I thought I could protect you. I thought if I was hard enough, strict enough, I could keep you from feeling what I felt, from suffering like I did. But I was wrong. I see that now." I stood there, my mind reeling. Pastor John's confession was a crack in the foundation of everything I'd known about Shiloh, about faith, about love. I wanted to be angry, to hate him for the pain he'd caused Caleb, but all I felt was pity. He'd spent his life running from himself, and now he was facing it. Too late. Caleb's voice was quiet when he spoke. "What happened to Thomas?" Pastor John's face crumpled. "He left. Moved to Chicago. Cut ties with everyone. I heard he died a few years ago. Alone. The word hung in the air, heavy with regret. Caleb turned away, his hands clenched into fists. I wanted to reach for him, to pull him close, but I didn't know if he'd let me. Not now. Not with his father watching. Not with the weight of this truth between us. I don't want that for you, Pastor John said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't want you to hide who you are. Not anymore. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wide. What are you saying? I'm saying I was wrong, Pastor John said, standing now, his voice stronger. I'm saying I love you, Caleb, and I want you to be happy, even if it means letting go of the life I planned for you. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I looked at Caleb, saw the tears in his eyes, the way his shoulders shook with the weight of his father's words. I reached for his hand again, and this time, he let me hold it, his fingers curling tightly around mine. I need time, Caleb said finally, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to do with this. Pastor John nodded, his face etched with pain. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. We left the study, the house, the weight of that conversation trailing behind us. Outside, the night was cool, the stars bright above Shiloh. Caleb stopped in the yard, his breath hitching as he turned to me. Eli, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know what to do. I pulled him into my arms, holding him as tightly as I could. We'll figure it out, I whispered. Together. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. Caleb and I met at the creek when we could, our hands finding each other in the dark, our voices low as we tried to make sense of what we were feeling. Shiloh felt smaller than ever, its streets lined with eyes that seemed to know too much. But in those moments by the water, it was just us, and the world felt possible. Pastor John kept his distance, giving Caleb space, but his confession had changed something in him. He was quieter in his sermons, his words less fire and brimstone, more about forgiveness, about love. The congregation noticed, whispering in the pews, but no one dared ask. I wondered how long it would take for Shiloh to unravel under the weight of its own secrets. Caleb was struggling. I could see it in the way he carried himself, the way his smiles didn't reach his eyes. He loved his father, but the years of pressure, of being molded into someone he wasn't, had left scars. And now, with Pastor John's past laid bare, Caleb was grappling with a new kind of pain knowing his father had suffered the same way, had chosen a different path. One night, as we sat by the creek, Caleb broke the silence. I'm scared, Eli, he said, his voice raw. What if I stay here? What if I turn into him? You won't, I said, taking his hand. You're not him. You're you. He looked at me, his eyes searching. And what if you leave? You're going to Nashville, Eli. You're getting out. What happens to us then? The question hit me like a punch. I hadn't let myself think about it, about leaving Caleb behind. Nashville was my escape, my chance at a life where I didn't have to hide. But the thought of leaving him, of losing what we had, was unbearable. We'll make it work, I said, my voice fierce. I'm not losing you, Caleb. Not now, not ever. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, and for a moment, we just breathed, the world fading away. Then he kissed me, soft and tentative at first, then deeper, like he was pouring everything he felt into that single moment. It was our first kiss, and it felt like a promise, a vow to fight for whatever this was. But Shiloh wasn't done with us. The next morning, rumors started spreading. Someone had seen us by the creek, had seen the way we looked at each other. By noon, the whispers had reached the church, and by evening, they'd reached Pastor John. He called us to his study again, his face pale but resolute. "They're talking," he said, his voice steady. "The town. They know." Caleb's face went white. "What do they know?" "Enough," Pastor John said. "Enough to make things hard for you. For both of you." I felt sick, the weight of Shiloh's judgment pressing down on me. I'd always known this was a possibility, but facing it now, with Caleb beside me, made it real. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. Pastor John looked at us, his eyes heavy with regret. "You have two choices. You can stay and fight, or you can leave. But whatever you choose, I'll stand by you." Caleb's hand found mine under the desk, and I held on tight. "I don't want to run," he said, his voice firm. "This is my home. I'm not ashamed of who I am." I looked at him, my heart swelling with pride, with love. "Then we stay?" I said. "We face it together." Pastor John nodded, a faint smile breaking through his pain. "Then we'll face it as a family." The days that followed were a storm. The whispers turned to shouts. The congregation split between those who supported Pastor John and those who called for his resignation. Caleb and I walked through town with our heads high, our hands brushing but not quite holding, a silent rebellion against the stairs. It wasn't easy. There were cruel words, cold shoulders, even a brick through the church window one night. But we had each other, and we had Pastor John, who stood in the pulpit and spoke of love, of acceptance, of a God who didn't turn away from anyone. Slowly, things began to shift. A few members of the congregation stood by us, their voices small but steady. Caleb's mom, quiet all these years, started speaking up, her love for her son fiercer than anyone expected. And Pastor John, for the first time, seemed at peace, like he'd finally let go of the weight he'd carried for so long. Spring came to Shiloh, the woods bursting with green, the air warm with possibility. Caleb and I were still here, still fighting, still together. The town hadn't fully accepted us, but it was changing, one heart at a time. Pastor John's sermons had become a beacon for those who felt lost, who felt different, and people from neighboring towns started coming, drawn by stories of a preacher who'd faced his own truth and lived to tell it. Caleb and I made plans. I deferred my scholarship for a year, unwilling to leave him while things were still fragile. We talked about moving to Nashville together one day, about building a life where we didn't have to hide. But for now, Shiloh was home, and we were determined to make it better. One afternoon, we went back to the woods, just the two of us. No rifles this time, just a blanket and a thermos of coffee. We sat by the creek, the same spot where we'd first said, "I love you," and Caleb took my hand, his smile brighter than I'd ever seen it. "I used to think I'd never be free," he said, his voice soft. "But you showed me I could be." I leaned against him, my heart full. "You showed me, too." We stayed there until the stars came out, the woods quiet around us. No longer a place of secrets, but a place of promises. Pastor John's confession had broken something open in Shiloh, in us, and though the road ahead was uncertain, we were walking it together. As we lay on the blanket, Caleb's head on my chest, I thought about the deer we'd seen that day in the woods, its eyes wide and fearless. I'd been so scared then, so sure I'd never be brave enough to face the truth. But here we were, not running, not hiding, just living. And that was enough. The future was waiting, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to meet it. Not with Caleb by my side. Not with the love we'd fought for. Not with the hope that had taken root in Shiloh. We'd gone hunting in the woods. But what we'd found was something far greater, a truth worth fighting for. A love worth keeping. And a home worth building.